You have just heard a lot about some of the future of what we'd like to do in space, what we want to do, and if we can do it. I thought I'd turn back the clock tonight, back and talk a little bit about those 4 flights that Amelia just mentioned. You know, not just what I did, but what did I get out of it? What did I accomplish, or what did we find out about it on those 4 flights? The first one, Gemini 7, way back in 1965, was a medical flight, a 2-week mission. And why was it 2 weeks? It was because in looking at going to the moon, and we were working on Apollo at that time, we determined that a 2-week mission would be the longest type of mission to accomplish that objective. So we said to ourselves, can man live in 0 gravity for 2 weeks? I mean, don't we evolve here on Earth? You know, ever since man began, didn't we have the gravity of Earth, and some of our functions sort of, requiring Earth's gravity to live? And so we thought we'd give it a try. And Frank Borman was with me on that particular flight, and we got up into space, into Gemini 7, my first flight. Very, very kind of interesting on that first flight to just really figure out, all the things that are happening. I sort of let the rocket ride me for a little bit. We did 23 various experiments. We had medical devices on for blood pressure and things of this nature, heart rate. And we found out that man could live very comfortably in 0 gravity. And as a matter of fact, there were certain things that we did discover, though, was the fact that the 0 gravity quickly deteriorated the muscles of the legs. If you're not using your legs, and every one of us use our legs every day, and you keep them in good shape. But if you take gravity away, the legs quickly lose their tune, and when I got back on the carrier after 2 weeks, I actually had to force myself to walk the carrier deck because of my leg muscles. We do now, of course, and we did it in the shuttle for many years, we put equipment on board to really strengthen the legs and strengthen the whole body. We found out some other things too. The heart slows down about 10 beats slower than what it does normally. For example, if your heart is beating now around 72, up there it would slowly go down to 62. It takes some time, though, for the body, or the brain, I should say, to realize that. Because when you first get into 0 gravity, you feel like you're leaning over a bar. If you're a young kid at one time, leaning over a bar and the blood rushing to your head, because the heart is still pumping. But it doesn't have to pump against the gravitational pressure to put blood up to your head. So the heart slows down. The amount of blood in your body slowly decreases too, because that amount of blood that you need living on Earth is more than you need in space, only because there's extra blood to prevent blood from flowing down into your legs while you're here on Earth. So these are the little things that we found out medically on that Gemini 7 flight. That flight also was the first rendezvous that we did, not docking, but just rendezvousing Gemini 6 with Gemini 7. They were supposed to rendezvous with an unmanned vehicle, but it didn't make it into space. And so since we were a 2-week mission, they rescheduled Gemini 6 and set it up, and we rendezvoused just in the last couple of days of our flight. The second flight was Gemini 12. It was the last of the Gemini series. And we still have some things to do. The basic thing that we had to perfect, because we couldn't do it in the previous flights, was going outside the spacecraft, working outside, because we felt that that would have to be necessary in the future. The Geminis 9, 10, and 11, all the people, the co-pilot of all those three flights, opened the hatch, got outside to do some work. But they found out that just working back and forth, their heart rate went up. They were exercising more and more. And they're breathing heavily, and they were fogging their face mask. And so what we discovered was that we all forgot Newton's third law of motion. To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And when you take Earth's gravity away and you get outside next to a spacecraft and you go over to the spacecraft to start touching it or getting ready, it repels you. And these people were fighting this zero gravity and fighting the fact that they didn't have the ability to do what they wanted to do. They didn't have the proper handholds or footholds. And so on Gemini 12, we had to do work to see if we could solve that problem. It must have been a brilliant engineer that came up with the idea. But he said, look, why don't we simulate zero gravity underwater? And we thought about that for a while. A spacesuit works just as well underwater as it does in space. And so we got Buzz Aldrin, who was my companion. We rented a boys' pool up in Baltimore, and we got him in the spacesuit, and we had a mock-up of the back of the Gemini 12 spacecraft sunk under the water, and we had electrical communication cord, of course, and hoses and everything for him. And we said, Buzz, now go down there. We've perfected some of these footholds and handholds. See what you can do. And one thing we don't want you to do is don't swim. You gotta float. And so he did. And this turned out to be the perfect device to train people to go outside the spacecraft to do things with other spacecraft or repair the International Space Station. You've seen that probably all on TV at one time. And Buzz managed to go out 3 times in Gemini 12 in 5.5 hours. So that was really the main thing that we did on 12. And I was very happy to be part of that. I was recycled again. This time, actually, I was supposed to be on Apollo 11, but Mike Collins finally had an old aircraft injury, and he had to step aside, and he took my place on 11, and I took his place on Apollo 8. Now, Apollo 8, it was probably the high point of my flight career. It was the first flight to go to the moon, of course. I was the navigator. The first time we had a verified navigation going all the way. The first time we had to check communications all the way out there. The first time that 3 people circled the moon and we saw the far side of the moon live. The Russians did take some foggy looking pictures before. The only thing they saw was the Sea of Moscow and that, but we saw it very close, up to 60 miles, and we were like 3 school kids looking into a candy store window. We forgot the flight plan. We were just looking as those craters slowly went by, and we looked at everything, and it was really a magnificent sight. But it wasn't the best sight that we saw. The moon is all shades of gray, regardless of what you see, and even when you saw just recently the reddish moon a couple nights ago. But it's all shades of gray. The biggest sight that we saw, the most impressive thing that we saw, was what you just saw on the screen, Earthrise. It was really something that just suddenly, to look at it, said, that's where we live. And we're only 240,000 miles away. And I could put my thumb up to the Earth and hide it completely. Everything that I've ever known, all the people I've known, everything that's going on in the world, I can hide behind my thumb. And you get to feel about, gee, how unimportant we all are now. and because the Earth is there, and when you hide it behind your thumb, it's gone. But the Earth itself is orbiting a rather normal star, and that star is tucked away on the outer edge of a galaxy called the Milky Way, and that's only one of millions of galaxies in the universe. And then I thought to myself, how fortunate we all are. We have a body here of the appropriate size with enough gravity to maintain the water and the atmosphere, and yet at the proper distance from the sun, not too close, not too far, that gives us the energy that allows us to evolve life here. We are astronauts. You're all astronauts. And this is really a spacecraft Earth that has limited resources. And we all should be really, recognize that fact that you are a very privileged people to be here on the Earth. My last flight was Apollo 13. I'm sure you've all seen the movie. Well, lots of you probably saw the movie. I'm not too sure. The movie, by the way, was very accurate. It's amazing that movie people can make an accurate movie. Actually, Ron Howard had to, it wasn't what he had to put in to keep it going, it was what he had to take out, because when he originally did the movie, and the movie was about 3 hours long, and Universal said there's no way we're going to have a movie 3 hours long. The people make their money selling popcorn and Coke, so he had to cut quite a bit down. This was my most challenging flight. It was to be the third lunar landing mission. The first two missions were actually not scientific missions per se. These were missions that was a challenge to the Soviets at that time in that race, that we had the ability to put someone on the moon and get them back home safely before the end of the decade. As a matter of fact, prior to Apollo 8, we had intelligence information that the Soviets were going to put a man around in the late autumn of 1968 to at least go around the moon, not to orbit, just to go around and come back again. And so that's why we made a bold decision. Apollo 8, by the way, was going to be an Earth orbital flight, but we had that information, and we also had the fact that the lunar module was not going to be ready for that flight. So we changed it, a very bold decision. But Apollo 13 was of a different nature. This is where it was really a classic case of crisis management, a case where those attributes that are so necessary for any business to succeed. Good leadership, not just at the top of the organization, but good leadership throughout the organization. Because leadership develops teamwork. And teamwork is really the glue that keeps any company going. And then there was initiative, imagination, because the best laid plans are sometimes, filled with different problems. A crisis arises. And we had several crises, of course, on Apollo 13. But we had people back at Mission Control that could think through and find solutions to crises. I'll give you one example of this particular flight. We had in the lunar module, which was designed for only 2 people for 2 days, and we were by this time, after the explosion, in the lunar module, using it as a lifeboat somehow to get home. But there were 3 people. The lunar module was designed for 2 people for 2 days. You merely don't power it up until you get into lunar orbit, detach, go down, rendezvous, dock, go back, and then, or go down and land and dock and rendezvous, and then we threw the vehicle away. And it was designed to only last 45 hours. But when I looked at the people we had, there was 1, 2, 3, I knew we were in trouble. One of the problems was breathing. You know, when you exhale carbon dioxide. Now, in the lunar module, we had lithium hydroxide canisters merely to absorb the carbon dioxide for 2 people for 2 days. And there were 3 people, and we were all breathing. And consequently, the partial pressure, or the amount of carbon dioxide, kept rising and rising. Fortunately, Mission Control, through the telemetry, saw the same effect happening that we saw when the light came on that said we were getting dangerously up to about 15%. And so they figured out how to get rid of the carbon dioxide, because in the command module, we had plenty of canisters to get rid of the carbon dioxide, but they were square. And in the lunar module, we had round canisters, cylinders. And you can't take a square canister to put into a round hole. And the command module, of course, was dead. We couldn't use it at all. So the way the Cruise Systems Division figured this out was to use duct tape, piece of plastic, a piece of cardboard from an old folder, and an old sock. And through that, they were able to control and flow the cycle of the atmosphere through the environmental system into this square canister. And of course, it saved us from being poisoned. That was just the one thing that happened there. Many, many different crises happened. And we found out, and I might just tell you what happened. I don't think you probably saw in the movie, or you read the book, or you just read things, what really caused Apollo 13 to have an explosion. It happened 6 years before we took off. At that time, one of the manufacturers was building the spherical liquid oxygen canisters, big round things. And as they were coming down, one of them was dropped at the factory. It was scheduled for Apollo 10. Well, they picked it up and they recycled it, and everything that it had to do in flight worked perfectly. So because it was delayed in its manufacture, they rubbed off Apollo 10 and chalked on Apollo 13. That canister the tank was put into the Apollo 13 spacecraft. 2 weeks before we were to take off, we did what was known as a countdown demonstration test. The spacecraft was fully loaded with all its consumables. Flight crew got into the spacecraft. The ground crew, the launch crew, got into positions, and we counted the spacecraft down to 0. Of course, we didn't launch, but we wanted to make sure everything was fine. Good test, final test. When it was over with, the ground crew came in to secure the spacecraft. One thing they did was to hook up, first of all, hook up the hose of pressurized oxygen and into the tanks, and then force the liquid oxygen out through the filler tank, one and the other one. But when it happened, and they did this, the gas came out and the liquid oxygen stayed just in the tank. This had never happened before. Something entirely new. They couldn't figure out what the story was. So they went back to their offices to look at the history and the schematics of these tanks, and they found out this tank was dropped at the factory. And then they saw that it was dropped in the factory. There was a tube that could have been loosened, whose sole purpose was to remove the oxygen after a test. It had nothing to do with the flight. And so they thought, well, if we remove the tank, it's going to delay the flight a whole month. Have to do all these tests all over again. But they said there's a heater system in that tank. Why don't we turn on the heater and boil the oxygen out? And they said, that's fine, let's try that. So they hooked up ground power, turned it on, and by gosh, they were right. About 6 hours, they had gotten the liquid oxygen all out of the tank. What they didn't know was that the heater system was designed for the electrical power in the spacecraft, which was secured. That was 28-volt DC power. What they hooked up from ground power down at the Cape was 65-volt DC power. As the temperature went up inside the tank to remove the liquid oxygen, and it got up to the top of about 80 degrees up here as the liquid oxygen slowly almost went out, a little thermostat was there to protect the tank from overheating. But when its contacts started to open up to shut off the power, the 65 volts welded them shut. We know now that the temperature inside that tank got up to be about 900 degrees Fahrenheit. No one caught it. It looked perfect. And on launch day, we filled up the tank for a second time, and then it was a bomb waiting to go off. And of course, the bomb happened 2 days later. Thank you very much.